The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of the downtown municipal building, as dozens of people gathered in what appeared to be an ordinary queue. Margaret Chen stood quietly near the middle of the line, clutching a worn leather folder against her chest. At 67 years old, she had learned the value of patience, though today felt different somehow. The air buzzed with an unusual energy that made her stomach flutter with nervous anticipation. Margaret had received the letter 3 weeks ago, written on official government letterhead with gold embossing that caught the light when she held it up to her kitchen window. The message was brief but formal, requesting her presence at this ceremony to receive recognition for her contributions to the community. She had read it several times, each reading making her more confused than the last. What contributions? She was just a retired seamstress who had spent 40 years working in the back room of Chen's Alterations, the small shop her late husband had opened in Chinatown. The people around her seemed more confident, more prepared for whatever was about to happen. The man directly in front of her wore an expensive navy suit and kept checking his gold watch, muttering about having important meetings later in the day. Behind her, a woman in designer shoes tapped her foot impatiently while speaking loudly into her phone about stock options and board meetings. Margaret felt increasingly out of place in her simple black dress, the one she wore to church every Sunday, and had carefully pressed that morning with the same iron she had used for decades, as the line began to move slowly toward the building's main entrance. Margaret noticed how the other recipients carried themselves. They walked with purpose, their heads held high, many of them greeting each other with warm handshakes and knowing smiles. Some clutched official-looking documents, others had photographers following them, snapping pictures as they made their way toward the ceremony. Margaret wondered if she had missed something important in the instructions, if there was some protocol she should have followed. The woman behind her, still engaged in her phone conversation, suddenly bumped into Margaret. As the line lurched forward unexpectedly, Margaret stumbled slightly, dropping her folder, and several papers scattered across the ground. As she bent down to collect them, she heard the woman huff loudly with irritation. "Excuse me," the woman said sharply, not bothering to help as Margaret scrambled to gather her documents. "Some of us have schedules to keep. Maybe you could pay attention to where the line is moving?" Margaret's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she quickly collected her papers. The man in the navy suit turned around briefly, glanced at Margaret with mild annoyance, and shook his head before turning back to face forward. She felt invisible, like a small pebble that had somehow rolled into the wrong garden. The familiar weight of being overlooked settled on her shoulders, the same feeling she had carried through most of her adult life. As they approached the registration desk, Margaret could hear fragments of conversations around her. People discussed their achievements, their awards, their recognition in various fields. A tall man with silver hair spoke animatedly about his contributions to medical research, while a younger woman nearby proudly mentioned her work in environmental conservation. Margaret listened to these conversations with growing unease, wondering if there had been some terrible mistake. When it was finally her turn at the registration desk, Margaret approached the young volunteer with hesitant steps. The volunteer, a bright-eyed college student with a warm smile, looked up from her clipboard and computer screen. "Good morning. Name, please?" the volunteer asked cheerfully. "Margaret Chen," she replied softly, almost whispering. The volunteer's fingers flew across the keyboard, and Margaret watched as her expression shifted from routine efficiency to puzzled concentration. The typing stopped, and the volunteer frowned, slightly at her screen. "I'm sorry, could you spell that for me? I want to make sure I have the right person." Margaret spelled out her name carefully, watching as the volunteer entered each letter with deliberate precision. There was another pause, longer this time, and Margaret felt her anxiety rising. Maybe she really didn't belong here. Maybe the letter had been sent to the wrong address meant for someone else entirely. The volunteer murmured, squinting at her screen. "The system seems to be, let me try searching differently." Behind Margaret, the line was growing restless. She could feel the impatience radiating from the people waiting, could sense their irritation at this unexpected delay. The woman in designer shoes cleared her throat loudly, a sound that clearly expressed her displeasure at having to wait. "Is there a problem here?" the navy-suited man asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his concerns addressed. Immediately. Some of us have been waiting quite a while. The volunteer looked up apologetically. I'm so sorry for the delay. I'm having a small technical difficulty, but I'll have this resolved in just a moment. Margaret wanted to disappear. She wanted to quietly step out of line, walk back to her small apartment, and pretend this whole confusing morning had never happened. But something kept her feet planted firmly on the ground, some small spark of determination that surprised her. She had received that letter after all. It had her name on it, her address. She had every right to be here, even if she couldn't understand why. The volunteer made a phone call, speaking in hushed tones to someone Margaret couldn't see. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, the volunteer hung up and turned back to Margaret with an apologetic smile. I'm terribly sorry about the confusion, Mrs. Chen. It seems there's been a small mix-up with our computer system today. If you could just wait here for a moment, someone will be right with you to get this sorted out. The people behind Margaret in line were directed around her to other registration desks, their relief at avoiding further delays evident in their quickened pace. Margaret found herself standing alone beside the desk, still clutching her folder, still unsure of what was happening or why she was there. As she waited, she watched the other honorees move smoothly through the process and disappear into the building's interior. Each person seemed to know exactly where they belonged, exactly what they were there to receive. Margaret had never felt more out of place in her entire life, yet something deep inside her refused to give up and go home. A few minutes later, an older woman in an elegant gray suit approached Margaret with purposeful strides. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent years navigating complex situations with grace and efficiency. Mrs. Chen, the woman asked, extending her hand. I'm Dr. Patricia Williams, the event coordinator. I understand we've had a small technical issue this morning. Would you mind coming with me so we can get this resolved properly? Margaret shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and genuine warmth in Dr. Williams's eyes. For the first time since arriving, she felt like someone actually saw her as a person rather than an inconvenience. I'm not entirely sure I should even be here, Margaret admitted as they walked toward a quieter corner of the lobby. There might have been some kind of mistake. Dr. Williams paused and studied Margaret's face carefully. There was something in her expression that suggested she knew more about this situation than she was letting on. Mrs. Chen, I don't think there's been any mistake at all. In fact, I suspect you're exactly where you need to be. Dr. Williams led Margaret to a quiet alcove near the main lobby, away from the bustling crowd of honorees who continued to stream through the registration process. The older woman gestured toward two comfortable chairs positioned near a large window that overlooked the city's historic district. Please sit down, Dr. Williams said gently. I'd like to understand a bit more about why you're here today. You mentioned you might not belong here. Margaret settled into the chair carefully, her worn folder still pressed against her chest, like a shield. She felt overwhelmed by the kindness in Dr. Williams's voice, so different from the impatience she had encountered in the registration line. I received this letter, Margaret began, opening her folder with trembling fingers. She pulled out the official invitation and handed it to Dr. Williams. But I think there's been some confusion. I'm nobody special. I worked in a little alteration shop for 40 years. I sew buttons and hem dresses. I don't understand why I would be honored for anything. Dr. Williams examined the letter carefully, her experienced eyes taking in every detail. Margaret watched her face for signs of recognition or confusion, hoping for some clue about what was happening. The coordinator's expression remained neutral, but Margaret caught a brief flicker of something that might have been surprise. This letter is definitely authentic, Dr. Williams confirmed, handing it back. It's signed by the mayor himself and bears the official city seal. Mrs. Chen, do you mind if I ask you some questions about your work at the alteration shop? Margaret nodded, though she couldn't imagine what there was to discuss about hemming pants and taking in waistbands. Chen's Alterations was my husband's business originally. After he passed away 12 years ago, I kept it running. It's not Much, just a small shop in Chinatown, but it pays the bills and keeps me busy. How long were you in business total? 43 years this past spring, Margaret replied. We opened in 1981, just after we got married. David had learned tailoring from his father back in Taiwan, and I picked up sewing from my mother. We made a good team. Dr. Williams leaned forward slightly, her interest clearly piqued. That's quite a long time to serve the same community. You must have had many customers over the years. Oh yes, Margaret said, her face softening as memories surfaced. We knew everyone in the neighborhood. Mrs. Kowalski brought us her husband's work, shirts every month for 25 years. The Hernandez family trusted us with their children's school uniforms and graduation gowns. We altered wedding dresses for 3 generations of the Murphy family. That sounds like more than just a business. It sounds like you were an important part of people's lives. Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I suppose we helped people look their best for important occasions. But that's just what you do when you run a shop. You take care of your customers. Dr. Williams made a few notes on a small pad she had pulled from her jacket pocket. Mrs. Chen, do you remember ever working with anyone from the city government? Perhaps altering uniforms for city employees or doing work for any municipal departments? Well, yes, Margaret said slowly, trying to recall specific details. We did uniforms for the fire department for several years. Their regular supplier had quality problems, and Captain Morrison asked if we could help out temporarily. That temporary arrangement lasted about 8 years, until David's arthritis got too bad for that kind of heavy work. 8 years of fire department uniforms, Dr. Williams repeated, making another note. That's quite significant. Do you remember any other work like that? Margaret thought carefully, surprised by how many memories were surfacing. There were the police auxiliary volunteers. They needed their uniforms altered to fit properly, and the department didn't have a budget for new ones. We did that work for free for about 5 years whenever they brought someone new in. Dr. Williams looked up from her notes. For free? Of course, Margaret said, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. These were volunteers putting their time into helping the community. The least we could do was make sure their uniforms fit properly so they could do their jobs well. What about the courthouse? Any work there? Oh yes, the courthouse, Margaret smiled at the memory. Judge Henderson was a very tall, thin man, and he could never find suits that fit him properly off the rack. We tailored all his judicial robes and court attire for 15 years. He always said he felt more confident presiding over cases when he knew his clothes fit perfectly. Dr. Williams was writing more rapidly now, and Margaret began to sense that these seemingly ordinary memories might be more important than she had realized. The coordinator's body language had shifted from polite inquiry to focused attention. Mrs. Chen, I'm starting to understand something important here, but let me ask you about something else entirely. Do you remember the summer of 1993? There was a major flood in the Riverside district. Margaret's eyes widened. Oh my goodness, yes. That was terrible. So many families lost everything when the river broke through the levee. The community center was turned into an emergency shelter. Do you remember doing any work related to that flood? David and I spent 3 weeks at the community center, Margaret said, the memories flooding back as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. People had lost all their clothes, and the donated items never fit anyone properly. We set up our sewing machines right there in the gymnasium and altered clothes day and night so families would have something decent to wear while they got back on their feet. 3 weeks of volunteer work, Dr. Williams noted. That must have been exhausting. It was necessary, Margaret replied simply. Those people needed help, and we had skills that could make a difference. Mrs. Patterson had 5 children, and none of the donated school clothes fit any of them properly. Can you imagine sending children to school in clothes that don't fit? After they've already lost their home, we stayed until every child had clothes that made them feel normal again. Dr. Williams set down her pen and studied Margaret's face carefully. Mrs. Chen, I'm beginning to think the computer system wasn't having technical difficulties. I think it was having trouble locating your file because you've been categorized differently than most of our honorees. What do you mean? Most of the people being honored today are being recognized for single significant achievements or contributions. a medical breakthrough, a successful business venture, a notable charitable donation. But your contributions, they're woven throughout decades of quiet service that probably never made headlines. Margaret felt a flutter of something she couldn't quite identify. Hope, maybe? Or perhaps just confusion about where this conversation was heading. I need to make a few phone calls, Dr. Williams continued, standing up from her chair. Mrs. Chen, would you be willing to wait here a little longer? I have a feeling this morning is about to become much more interesting than either of us expected. As Dr. Williams walked away with purposeful strides, Margaret remained in her chair by the window, watching the city bustle with its usual morning energy. She thought about all the conversations she'd just had, all the memories that had been stirred up by Dr. Williams's questions. For 43 years, she and David had simply done what seemed right, what seemed necessary, what seemed kind. They had never thought of it as anything special, certainly nothing worthy of recognition or honor. But sitting there in that quiet alcove, Margaret began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the ordinary kindness of everyday life was more extraordinary than she had ever imagined. 20 minutes passed before Dr. Williams returned, but Margaret hardly noticed the time. She had become lost in memories that seemed to be surfacing faster than she could process them. The flood relief work had opened a floodgate of recollections she hadn't thought about in years. There had been so many small moments, so many times when she and David had simply done what needed doing without thinking it was anything remarkable. When Dr. Williams approached, she was accompanied by a younger man in a crisp white shirt and burgundy tie. He carried a thick folder and wore the expression of someone who had just discovered something important. Mrs. Chen, I'd like you to meet James Fletcher from our City Records Department, Dr. Williams said, gesturing to her companion. James has been researching your file and I think you'll find what he's discovered quite interesting. James Fletcher sat down across from Margaret and opened his folder, revealing what appeared to be dozens of documents, photographs, and official papers. Mrs. Chen, I have to admit, when Dr. Williams first called me, I thought there might have been some administrative error. Your name wasn't showing up in our usual database because you've never applied for recognition or asked for any kind of public acknowledgement. But when I started digging deeper, he pulled out the first document, a faded certificate with official city seals. This is a commendation from the fire department dated 1987. It praises Chen's alterations for exceptional service above and beyond the call of duty for your work during the warehouse district fire. Do you remember that? Margaret squinted at the document, memories slowly crystallizing. There was a big fire, and several firefighters had damaged gear. Their regular supplier couldn't get replacement uniforms for 2 weeks, but they needed to get back to work immediately. We worked around the clock for 3 days straight to get them properly fitted equipment. According to this report, James continued, your quick response potentially saved lives because those firefighters were able to return to active duty during a critical period when the department was understaffed. He set aside the certificate and pulled out another document. Here's another one from 1991. The police department thanked you for providing emergency uniform alterations during the Convention Week crisis. Convention Week, Margaret murmured. The department had to call in officers from surrounding jurisdictions, but none of the borrowed uniforms fit properly. They were worried about looking unprofessional during such an important event for the city. You altered 62 uniforms in 4 days, James read from the report. At no charge to the city, working 18-hour days to ensure every visiting officer could represent our city with dignity. Dr. Williams leaned forward. Mrs. Chen, did you keep copies of any of these commendations? Margaret shook her head. David might have kept some papers, but I never thought they were important. They were just thank you notes for doing our job. James pulled out a photograph that made Margaret gasp. It showed the community center during the 1993 flood, with rows of cots and families in various states of distress. In the background, she could clearly see herself and David at their sewing machines, surrounded by piles of donated clothing. This photo was taken by a newspaper photographer, James explained. It ran with a story about community volunteers responding to the disaster. The caption identifies you as local seamstress Margaret Chen, who with her husband spent weeks ensuring flood victims had properly fitted clothing for job interviews and school attendance. "I never saw that newspaper story," Margaret whispered, studying the photograph. She looked so much younger, her hair still black instead of gray, but her face wore the same expression of quiet determination she recognized in herself. "There's more," James continued, his enthusiasm growing. "Records show that Chen's alterations provided services for the annual Veterans Day Parade from 1985 to 2018. You altered uniforms for aging veterans whose sizes had changed, ensuring they could march with dignity. Those men served our country," Margaret said simply. "Making sure they looked sharp for the parade was the least we could do to show respect." James exchanged a meaningful look with Dr. Williams before continuing. "Mrs. Chen, do you remember the Sunshine Elementary School crisis in 1994? Margaret's face brightened. "Oh yes, that was heartbreaking. The school had a fire in their storage room and lost all the costumes for their spring musical. 60 children were going to have to cancel their performance, and they had worked so hard. Some of them came from families that rarely had anything to celebrate. According to the school principal's letter," James read, "you and your husband created 60 new costumes in 10 days, working for free so the children wouldn't be disappointed. The principal wrote that your generosity saved not just a school play, but the confidence and joy of children who had been looking forward to their moment on stage for months." Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes. Those children's faces when they saw their costumes. "David and I worked until our fingers were sore, but it was worth every stitch." Dr. Williams reached over and gently touched Margaret's arm. "Mrs. Chen, what James is showing you represents just the documented cases where someone thought to write an official thank you. But I suspect there are hundreds of similar stories that were never officially recorded." James nodded agreement. "From what I've found so far, Chen's Alterations was essentially functioning as an unofficial community service organization. Wedding dresses for low-income families at cost, job interview clothing for people trying to get back on their feet, school uniforms for children whose families couldn't afford new ones. The Morales family," Margaret said suddenly. "Their oldest daughter got accepted to college, but she didn't have anything appropriate for her interviews. We made her a beautiful suit that made her feel confident and professional. She became a doctor. Mrs. Patterson's son needed a tuxedo for prom, but the family was struggling after his father's accident," Margaret continued, memories flowing freely now. "David found a way to alter an old tuxedo to fit him perfectly. That young man felt like $1 million that night." Dr. Williams and James were both taking notes rapidly as Margaret's stories poured out. Each memory seemed to trigger another. Decades of quiet acts of service that had touched countless lives throughout the city. "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Williams said gently, "I need to ask you something important. When you received the invitation to today's ceremony, what did you think you were being honored for?" Margaret wiped away the tears that had started flowing down her cheeks. "I honestly thought it was a mistake. I kept thinking they meant to invite someone else. Someone who had done something actually important. I'm just a seamstress who tried to help when people needed help." James closed his folder and leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Chen, you've just described exactly why you're being honored today. The city has spent months researching individuals who have made lasting contributions to our community through sustained service over many years. Your name came up in more departments and more contexts than almost anyone else on the list." "But I never applied for anything," Margaret protested. "I never asked for recognition." "That's exactly why you're so worthy of it," Dr. Williams said warmly. "Mrs. Chen, you've spent 43 years making your community stronger. One person at a time, one family at a time, one crisis at a time. You never sought credit or publicity. You simply saw needs and found ways to meet them." Margaret sat quietly for a moment, trying to process everything she had just learned. The simple life she had thought she was living suddenly seemed much more significant when viewed through other people's eyes. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Dr. Williams smiled. "Now, Mrs. Chen, you get to take your place among the honored guests where you always belonged. But first, I think we need to make sure your story is told properly. The morning program is going to be very different from what we originally planned. Dr. Williams escorted Margaret through a side entrance that bypassed the main lobby entirely. As they walked down a carpeted hallway lined with portraits of former mayors and city officials, Margaret felt as though she was moving through a dream. Everything seemed surreal, from the marble floors beneath her feet to the realization that her simple life had somehow been worthy of official recognition. "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Williams said as they paused outside a door marked VIP Preparation Room, "I need to prepare you for what's about to happen. Word has started to spread about your story, and there are some people who would very much like to meet you before the ceremony begins." Margaret's stomach fluttered with nervous energy. "What kind of people?" "People whose lives you've touched over the years," Dr. Williams replied with a warm smile. "James made a few phone calls after our conversation, and it seems your impact on this community runs even deeper than we initially realized." The door opened, and Margaret found herself facing a room filled with familiar faces that she hadn't seen in years. At the front of the group stood Captain Morrison, now retired from the fire department but still imposing in his dress uniform. Beside him was a woman Margaret recognized as Judge Henderson's former bailiff, and near the window stood a family that made Margaret's heart skip a beat. "Mrs. Chen," called out a voice from across the room. A young woman in a white medical coat rushed forward with tears in her eyes. "Do you remember me? I'm Maria Morales. You made my interview suit when I was 18. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth in surprise. The scared teenage girl she remembered had been transformed into a confident professional woman. "Maria, look at you. You became a doctor just like you dreamed." "Dr. Maria Morales Patterson," the young woman corrected, beaming. "I'm chief of pediatrics at Children's Hospital now. And Mrs. Chen, I have worn that suit to every important interview and professional milestone of my career. I'm wearing the jacket today actually under my lab coat. It still fits perfectly because you taught me how to take care of good clothing." Captain Morrison stepped forward, his weathered face creased with emotion. "Mrs. Chen, I've been wanting to thank you properly for 37 years. During that warehouse fire crisis, my men were able to save 2 buildings and 3 lives because they had properly fitted gear that let them do their jobs safely. Your work that week was the difference between life and death for people in our community." Margaret felt overwhelmed as more people approached her, each with their own story of how her work had impacted their lives. A middle-aged man introduced himself as Tommy Patterson, the boy who had needed the prom tuxedo. He was now a successful contractor who employed 30 people in the city. "Mrs. Chen, that prom night gave me confidence I'd never had before," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I asked my dream girl to dance and she said yes. We've been married for 28 years now, and we have 3 children. That tuxedo you and Mr. David created for me changed the whole trajectory of my life." An elderly woman approached with the help of a walker, moving slowly but with determination. Margaret recognized her immediately as Mrs. Patterson, Tommy's mother, though she looked much frailer than Margaret remembered. "My dear Margaret," Mrs. Patterson said, reaching out to clasp Margaret's hands. "I never had the chance to properly thank you and David. After my husband's accident, we had nothing. You didn't just make Tommy a tuxedo that night. You gave him dignity, confidence, and hope. You gave our whole family hope." More stories poured out as the reunion continued. The elementary school principal, now retired, had brought photos of every spring musical production since 1994, showing children performing in costumes that Margaret had helped create. A fire department captain brought a plaque that had hung in the station house for 20 years, dedicated to the guardian angels of Chen's alterations. Judge Henderson himself, now in his 80s but still sharp and commanding, approached Margaret with formal dignity. "Mrs. Chen, for 15 years, you ensured that justice in my courtroom was presided over with appropriate gravitas. Every time I put on those robes, I was reminded that you had taken pride in your work, which reminded me to take pride in mine. You were a silent partner in every fair decision I made." Dr. Williams watched from the corner of the room as Margaret moved from person to person, listening to stories and reconnecting with people whose lives she had touched. The event coordinator found herself deeply moved by the authentic emotion in the room, the genuine gratitude that had been waiting years to be expressed. James Fletcher approached Dr. Williams with an updated folder, much thicker than the one he had brought earlier. "The phone hasn't stopped ringing," he reported quietly. "Once word got out that we were researching Mrs. Chen's contributions, people started calling with more stories. The Veterans Affairs Office found records of her work dating back to 1984. The school district has documentation of her contributions to 17 different schools over 30 years. How many people do you estimate she's helped directly, Doctor?" Williams asked. James flipped through his notes. "Based on what we've documented so far, and this is probably a conservative estimate, Mrs. Chen and her husband provided services to approximately 3,000 individuals over 4 decades. If you count family members who were indirectly affected, the number might be closer to 8,000 people." Dr. Williams looked back at Margaret, who was now surrounded by 3 generations of the Murphy family, all wearing clothing that had been altered by Chen's alterations for various milestone events. 8,000 people, she murmured. "That's nearly 2% of the city's population. And those are just the cases we can document," James added. "Mrs. Chen's impact on this community is immeasurable in the truest sense of the word." A young man in his 20s approached Margaret hesitantly, as if unsure whether he belonged in this gathering of distinguished guests. Margaret noticed his uncertainty and immediately walked over to him. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mrs. Chen," he said nervously. "I'm David Kim. You probably don't remember me, but you altered my job interview clothes about 5 years ago when I was just out of college. I couldn't afford much, and you charged me practically nothing for a complete wardrobe adjustment." Margaret studied his face for a moment, then smiled warmly. "David, of course I remember. You were so nervous about that engineering interview, and your father's old suit was much too big for you. How did the interview go?" "I got the job," David said, his nervousness melting away. "And Mrs. Chen, I've been promoted 3 times since then. I'm now the youngest project manager in my company's history. I brought something for you." He handed Margaret a small framed photograph. It showed a young man in a perfectly fitted suit, standing in front of a major construction project with a hard hat under his arm and a confident smile on his face. "This was taken when I was promoted to lead engineer on the new downtown bridge project," David explained. "Mrs. Chen, I want you to know that every success I've had in my career started with the confidence you gave me that day when you made my father's suit fit me perfectly. You didn't just alter clothing. You altered the course of my life." She looked around the room at all these faces, these lives that had somehow intersected with her simple existence in ways she had never fully understood. For the first time since receiving that mysterious invitation, she began to comprehend the magnitude of what she and David had accomplished through their quiet decades of service. Dr. Williams approached and gently touched Margaret's shoulder. "Mrs. Chen, it's almost time for the ceremony to begin. Are you ready to receive the recognition you've earned?" Margaret looked one more time around the room filled with people who had traveled from across the city just to see her honored. She thought about David, who should have been here to share this moment, and felt confident that somehow he was. "Yes," Margaret said quietly, straightening her shoulders with newfound dignity. "I think I'm ready." The auditorium was filled to capacity when Dr. Williams escorted Margaret through a side door near the stage. Margaret had expected to be seated in the audience with the other honorees, but instead found herself being guided to a special section, reserved for distinguished guests. The transformation from her morning experience in the registration line felt almost overwhelming. As she took her seat, Margaret noticed that the people who had been so impatient with her earlier were now scattered throughout the audience, most of them seated in the general honoree section. The man in the navy suit was 3 rows behind her, and the woman in designer shoes was on the opposite side of the auditorium. Neither of them seemed to recognize her as the same person who had caused their minor inconvenience that morning. The ceremony began with the usual formalities. The mayor welcomed everyone and spoke about the importance of recognizing community service. Several awards were presented for business achievement, charitable donations, and professional excellence. Each recipient received polite applause as they walked across the stage to accept their plaques and certificates. Margaret watched the proceedings with growing nervousness. Her name hadn't appeared on the printed program she'd been given, and she began to wonder if there had been some last-minute change of plans. Maybe Dr. Williams and James had discovered that her invitation really had been a mistake after all. Then the mayor's tone shifted, becoming more personal and reflective. Ladies and gentlemen, our final presentation today is somewhat different from our usual recognition awards. Sometimes the most profound contributions to our community come not from grand gestures or public campaigns, but from quiet, consistent service that spans decades. Margaret felt her heart begin to race as the mayor continued. Today we honor someone whose story came to our attention not through any application or nomination, but through the spontaneous testimonials of countless community members who have been touched by her work over 4 decades of service. When our research team began investigating her contributions, they discovered something extraordinary. A single individual whose impact on our city has been both immeasurable and largely invisible. The auditorium had grown completely silent, and Margaret could feel hundreds of eyes focused on the mayor's words. "Mrs. Margaret Chen, would you please join me on stage?" The applause that erupted was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. It wasn't the polite, brief clapping that had followed the earlier presentations. This was sustained, heartfelt applause that seemed to come from every corner of the auditorium. People stood up, and Margaret realized that many of the faces in the audience were familiar to her, though she couldn't immediately place where she knew them from. Dr. Williams helped Margaret to her feet and escorted her toward the stage. As they walked, Margaret noticed that the applause was growing rather than diminishing. People throughout the audience were calling out, "Thank you, Mrs. Chen," and "We love you, Margaret." She began to recognize faces she hadn't seen in years, customers from the shop, neighbors from Chinatown, families she had helped during various crises over the decades. When she reached the podium, the mayor waited for the applause to subside before continuing his remarks. "Mrs. Chen, what makes your story so remarkable is not just the scope of your service, but the spirit in which it was given. Our research has documented your contributions to emergency response efforts, community crisis management, youth development, veteran support, and countless individual acts of kindness that have strengthened the fabric of our city." Margaret stood beside the mayor, still feeling as though she might be dreaming. The bright stage lights made it difficult to see the audience clearly, but she could feel the warmth of their attention and support. "However," the mayor continued, "rather than simply listing your achievements, we thought it would be more appropriate to let some of the people you've helped tell your story themselves." A large screen descended behind the podium, and Margaret turned to see a video presentation beginning to play. The first image showed the exterior of Chen's alterations, as it had looked in the early 1980s, with a much younger Margaret and David standing proudly in front of their shop. Captain Morrison appeared on screen, now wearing his dress uniform with decades of service ribbons. "Margaret and David Chen were the backbone of our emergency response capability for years," his recorded voice said. "When we needed equipment altered or repaired quickly so we could save lives and protect property, they never hesitated. They never asked for payment when it was city business. They just did what needed to be done." The video cut to Dr. Maria Morales Patterson standing in her hospital office. "Mrs. Chen gave me more than a suit for my college interviews," she said, looking directly into the camera. "She gave me the confidence to believe I belonged in professional settings. Every day I walk into this hospital to care for children, I'm reminded that someone believed in me when I couldn't afford to believe in myself." Judge Henderson appeared next, seated in his former courtroom. "In 30 years on the bench, I learned that justice depends not just on legal knowledge, but on the dignity and respect we bring to our roles. Mrs. Chen understood that clothes don't just cover our bodies, they reflect our commitment to the responsibilities we carry. She helped me dress the part so I could better play the part." The testimonials continued, each one revealing another facet of Margaret's impact on the community. Teachers spoke about the school plays she had saved. Veterans described how she had ensured they could march with pride in parades. Young professionals talked about job interviews that had gone well because they felt confident in properly fitting clothes. Margaret watched in amazement as her simple life was reframed as a story of profound community service. She had never seen herself as anything more than a neighborhood seamstress, But these testimonials revealed a different perspective entirely. The video concluded with Tommy Patterson, now a successful contractor, standing in front of one of the buildings his company had constructed. "Mrs. Chen taught me that how we present ourselves to the world matters," he said. "The confidence I gained from wearing that prom tuxedo she made me carried forward into everything I've done since. I've built good buildings and employed good people partly because I learned from her that taking pride in our work, no matter how small it might seem, makes a difference in other people's lives." As the video ended and the screen retracted, the mayor turned to Margaret with a warm smile. "Mrs. Chen, the city of Harborview is proud to present you with our highest civilian honor, the Medal of Community Service, in recognition of 43 years of extraordinary dedication to your neighbors and your city." The medal was unlike anything Margaret had ever seen. It was crafted from silver and gold, with the city seal at its center surrounded by intricate engravings that depicted various aspects of community life. The mayor placed it around Margaret's neck, and the weight of it felt both substantial and symbolic. "Mrs. Chen, would you like to say a few words?" the mayor asked, gesturing toward the microphone. Margaret approached the podium slowly, looking out at the sea of faces that had somehow become familiar during this extraordinary morning. She thought about David, about all the late nights they had spent working on urgent projects for people who needed their help. She thought about the satisfaction they had found in solving small problems that made big differences in people's lives. "I don't really know what to say," Margaret began, her voice soft but carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. "David and I just did what seemed right. When people needed help, we tried to help. When there was work to be done, we did it. We never thought of ourselves as special." She paused, looking down at the medal hanging from her neck, then back up at the audience. "But today I've learned something important. I've learned that there are no small acts of kindness, only acts of kindness that seem small to the person doing them. Every person who has spoken to me today, everyone who has shared their story, has taught me that what David and I thought was just our job was actually our calling." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. "If I've made a difference in this community, it's because this community made a difference in me first. You trusted us with your important moments, your special occasions, your emergencies, your dreams. You let us be part of your stories, and that was the greatest honor we could have asked for." Margaret's voice grew stronger as she continued. "To anyone out there who thinks their work doesn't matter, who believes their small contributions don't make a difference, I want you to know that they do. Every act of service, every moment of care, every time you choose to help instead of looking away, you're building something bigger than yourself." She looked directly at the section where she recognized some of the faces from that morning's registration. Line. "We all have opportunities every day to serve our community. Sometimes it's through our jobs, sometimes it's through our volunteer work, and sometimes it's just through the way we treat the people we encounter in our daily lives." The applause that followed was even more sustained than before. But this time Margaret didn't feel overwhelmed by it. Instead, she felt grateful, humbled, and proud in a way she had never experienced. As she made her way back to her seat, she understood that the reception following the ceremony was held in the building's grand ballroom, a space Margaret had never seen before despite living in the city for over 4 decades. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables laden with elegant refreshments, and the walls were decorated with photographs showcasing the city's history and achievements. Margaret found herself at the center of constant attention, surrounded by well-wishers and people eager to share their own memories of Chen's alterations. What struck Margaret most profoundly was the diversity of the people who approached her. There were firefighters and police officers, teachers and business owners, young families and elderly couples. Some spoke perfect English, others communicated in a mixture of languages with enthusiastic gestures. All of them had one thing in common. They remembered specific moments when Margaret or David had made a difference in their lives. "Mrs. Chen," called out a voice from across the room. Margaret turned to see a woman in her 40s approaching with 3 teenagers in tow. "I'm Linda Santos. You probably don't remember me, but you altered my wedding dress 22 years ago." Margaret studied the woman's face for a moment. "Linda Martinez," she said suddenly. using the woman's maiden name. You were so nervous about getting married, and your mother's dress was 2 sizes too big. We had to completely reconstruct the bodice. Linda's face lit up with joy. You do remember. Mrs. Chen, I want you to meet my children. This is Maria. She's 17 and just got accepted to nursing school. This is Carlos. He's 15 and wants to be an engineer. And this is little Sophia. She's 13 and already talks about being a teacher. Margaret shook hands with each of the teenagers, noting their confident postures and bright smiles. Your mother looked beautiful on her wedding day, she told them. She wore her grandmother's dress, and it was such an honor to help preserve that family tradition. Mrs. Chen, Maria said, Mom has told us so many stories about your shop. She said you and Mr. David were like family to everyone in the neighborhood. That's because everyone in the neighborhood was like family to us, Margaret replied warmly. Your mother was one of our favorite brides. She brought us homemade tamales every Christmas for 15 years after her wedding. As the Santos family moved on to let others speak with Margaret, Dr. Williams approached with a distinguished older gentleman whom Margaret didn't recognize. Mrs. Chen, I'd like you to meet Dr. Robert Harrison. He's been the city's director of community development for the past decade. Dr. Harrison extended his hand with obvious respect. Mrs. Chen, it's an honor to finally meet you. I've been working in community development for 30 years, and I've never encountered anyone who has had such a sustained impact on a city's social fabric without ever appearing in any of our official programs or databases. I'm not sure I understand, Margaret said. What you and your husband accomplished was community development in its purest form, Dr. Harrison explained. You identified needs and addressed them directly, without bureaucracy, without funding applications, without publicity. You created stability in people's lives at crucial moments, which had ripple effects that are still being felt today. He pulled out a folder and showed Margaret a series of charts and graphs. We've been analyzing the economic and social impacts of your work, and the results are remarkable. The flood relief work you did in 1993, for example, helped speed the recovery process for affected families by an average of 6 weeks. That meant people got back to work faster, children returned to normal school routines sooner, and the overall community trauma was reduced significantly. Margaret looked at the official charts with bewilderment. We just hemmed pants and let out waistbands. You did much more than that, Dr. Harrison insisted. You restored dignity to people during their most vulnerable moments. You enabled them to present themselves confidently in job interviews, court appearances, school events, and social situations. The psychological impact of that support translated into measurable improvements in employment rates, educational achievement, and community stability. James Fletcher joined their conversation, carrying another thick folder. Mrs. Chen, we've been contacted by researchers from the university who want to study your model of community service. They're calling it embedded mutual aid because you provided essential services while maintaining deep, long-term relationships within the community you served. What does that mean for the future? Margaret asked. It means your legacy extends far beyond the individual lives you've touched, Dr. Harrison explained. We're developing new community programs based on the principles we've observed in your work. Long-term relationship building, immediate response to urgent needs, services provided with dignity and respect, and sustainable support that strengthens rather than creates dependency. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mayor Peterson himself, who had been making his way through the reception to speak personally with Margaret. Mrs. Chen, the mayor said warmly, I hope you're enjoying your moment in the spotlight. I have to tell you, in 20 years of public service, I've never seen a ceremony generate this kind of authentic emotional response from an audience. Thank you. You, Mr. Mayor. This has all been quite overwhelming. I imagine it has been. The mayor chuckled. Mrs. Chen, I wanted to speak with you about something important. The City Council has been discussing ways to honor your contributions beyond today's ceremony. We'd like to propose naming the new Community Service Center in your honor. Margaret's eyes widened. That's very kind, but I'm not sure that's appropriate. Mrs. Chen, the mayor continued, The building will house services for low-income families, emergency assistance programs, job training initiatives, and community crisis response coordination. These are all areas where you've demonstrated exceptional leadership over the decades. Having your name on the building would inspire future generations of community servants. Before Margaret could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught everyone's attention. A group of children in school uniforms had entered the reception, accompanied by several adults who appeared to be teachers. They were carrying handmade signs and wearing matching t-shirts. Dr. Williams smiled as she recognized what was happening. "Mrs. Chen, it looks like you have some additional visitors." The children approached in an organized group, their excitement barely contained. A girl who appeared to be about 10 years old stepped forward as their spokesperson. "Mrs. Chen," she began in a clear, confident voice, "we're from Sunshine Elementary School. We wanted to thank you for saving our spring musical tradition. Our teacher told us that you helped children perform on stage for 30 years, and we wanted you to know that we're still performing because of what you started." The children began to sing a song they had obviously practiced, their voices harmonizing sweetly as they performed a medley of songs from various school musicals over the years. Other reception guests gathered around to listen, and Margaret found herself crying again as she realized that her work was continuing to create joy for new generations of children. When the song ended, the young spokesperson presented Margaret with a handmade scrapbook filled with photos from school productions dating back decades. "Mrs. Chen, this book shows every spring musical at our school since 1994. Every costume, every performance, every happy child on stage happened because you cared enough to help when we needed help most." Margaret accepted the scrapbook with trembling hands, flipping through pages of smiling children in elaborate costumes, all of them experiencing the confidence and joy that comes from participating in something beautiful and meaningful. "Thank you," she whispered to the children. "Thank you for keeping the tradition alive." As the evening progressed and the reception began to wind down, Margaret found herself standing near the windows overlooking the city she had served for so many years. The lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk, and she could see the familiar outlines of neighborhoods where she had worked, people she had helped, lives she had touched. Dr. Williams joined her at the window. "Mrs. Chen, how are you feeling about everything that's happened today?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, contemplating the question. "I keep thinking about David," she said finally. "He would have been so proud, but also so surprised. We really did think we were just running a small business and helping our neighbors when we could. And that's exactly why today was so important," Dr. Williams replied. "The most powerful service often comes from people who don't think of themselves as serving, but simply as doing what needs to be done. You've shown this entire community what's possible when we choose to care for each other consistently, quietly, and without expectation of recognition." Margaret nodded slowly. "I understand now that this ceremony wasn't really about honoring me. It was about honoring the idea that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose service over self-interest." "What will you do now?" Dr. Williams asked. Margaret smiled, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since David's death. "I think I'll keep doing what I've always done, but maybe with a better understanding of why it matters. And maybe I'll find ways to help other people discover their own opportunities to serve." As Margaret prepared to leave the reception, she was surrounded one final time by the people whose lives